It is a privilege and an honor to welcome Janet Horvath back to Mount Zion's Bima. And this introduction may be a little bit long, so you might want to have a seat. Janet was here well before Rachel and I came to Mount Zion playing her cello for Blach's Kol Nidre so prayerfully on Yom Kippur for so many wonderful years. How many of you remember those wonderful years? I see many who are here who do. And actually, Rachel reminded me that Janet was also involved in the very first Our Bodies, Our Souls women's retreat here as well when we first started. Janet was the Minnesota Orchestra's associate principal cello for 32 years and performed throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. And since leaving the orchestra, Janet's focus has been on writing, and in 2017, she completed her MFA in creative writing from Hamlin. She has penned over 350 feature articles and 2 books. Her tiny love story appeared in the New York Times in 2021. Her appearances on national radio and television include Terry Gross's Fresh Air on NPR. And before I invite her to speak, I want to acknowledge that this has been a hard year for Mount Zion. In the last number of years, several of our prominent survivors have died. And this year, Erwin Farkas, our last survivor, who, like Janet's parents, was also from Hungary and was at Auschwitz, died. May his memory, may all of their memories be for a blessing. In fact, in the last couple decades, 19 of our survivors were actively telling their stories, teaching in schools across our community, being witnesses by their very being. Between the years 2011 and 2017, we had children of survivors speak here before Yom HaShoah, in part to assure to the survivors that their stories would be told after they were gone. Today we know of 32 people from Mount Zion, mostly in the second generation and a few in the third generation, who are in our congregation. If you are related to survivors in any way, spouses, relatives in any way, we would like to know. Please be in touch with me or Rabbi Adler, Cantor Strauss-Klein, Cantor Spilker. We will be in touch in the years to come to think together about how to tell the stories of your relatives. I would like to now ask all who are here, who are spouses of survivors, to stand and remain standing. All who are children of survivors to stand and remain standing. All who are grandchildren of survivors to stand and remain standing. All who are relatives of a survivor in any way to stand and remain standing. 4th generation, great-grandchildren. All who have been friends of survivors at Mount Zion or elsewhere to stand. We all have the responsibility to tell the stories that we have heard and been entrusted with. You may be seated. So tonight we have the privilege to hear a poignant story. Janet's book, The Cello Still Sings, is a story of survival and resilience, and how holding the story of that survival so close and keeping it secret was perhaps part of that survival and resilience.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak from the Bima tonight. It's an honor to share my story and my book, The Cello Still Sings, a generational story of the Holocaust and of the transformative power of music. My parents, George and Catherine Horvath, were professional musicians from Budapest, Hungary, and Holocaust survivors. Who would think that this elegant couple had suffered with starvation, deprivation, and terror. They looked like Austro-Hungarian royalty. Beneath the veneer, our family was haunted by an eerie hush surrounding their experiences, and music was our lifeline. I'm going to read a very brief excerpt that sets the tone, I think, for the evening. The cello's sound before conscious memory permeated my very being, its lush golden tones, the closest sound to the human voice. My earliest memories are of lying on the floor next to my father as he practiced the cello, the metronome marking the music's pulse. My parents never considered that my petite stature and tiny hands were not ideal for playing the cello or carrying the bulky beast in and out of vehicles and up staircases. Nonetheless, engulfing the instrument with my body in an embrace, I endeavored to produce the seductive sounds my father coaxed out of his cello. They remained devoted to making this a more beautiful world through music, but their past remained shrouded in silence. Over the years, I grew obsessed with the Holocaust, reading everything I could on the subject. I tried to imagine, then tried not to imagine, what my parents might have gone through. My core harbored the unspeakable, at times crushed by the repulsive burden. Breaking free was futile. I had been genetically stamped. In order to make sense of my parents, my upbringing, and ultimately my own baffling anxieties, I resolved to pursue truths about the past. As that generation passes away, many of us, G2s we call ourselves, are obsessed about researching the secrets of the past to learn our histories, determined to leave a legacy, a lasting legacy for the future. And so many of my generation missed their opportunity, and I was just extremely fortunate, and I'll tell you that story. Digging into the past seemed impossible. My parents never spoke about it, but we didn't need the words to hear the tune, which oozed into our genes. We gleaned we had to succeed in ways they couldn't, and live for those who didn't. In the last year of my father's life, he disclosed a deeply hidden secret. Driving on a wretched January day to yet another doctor's appointment, and you know what those days could be like. My father had been a successful cellist with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra for 38 years, who'd played with all the most famous maestros of Europe. And he loved to talk shop. Obviously, we were both cellists. And I had never thought to ask him about my own personal idol, Leonard Bernstein. So I finally get him in the car. I get the walker in the car. I settle into the driver's seat knowing that I had to clutch the steering wheel really carefully. And I thought, okay, what should we talk about? Okay, I'll ask him about, has he ever played with Leonard Bernstein? Dad, did you ever play with Leonard Bernstein? And suddenly he put his hand to his cheek, and he seemed to pass out. His eyes went into the back of his head, and I thought, what, should I pull over? What's going on? And I waited a couple of moments, and then it was as if he came to. He said, yes, it was a very hot day. He came. I played in the Jewish orchestra, and he came to Landsberg in the DP camps, and he played Rhapsody in Blue, and it was just fantastic. He was just a kid. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, we should take off our sweaters. We're schwitzing here. And he laughed with the Yiddish word. And then he said, I talked to him. I said, I want to go to America. And Bernstein said, no, you're a great Jewish musician. You should go to Palestine. And he recalled the program. He always remembered the music. And before I even could get my tongue around all the questions I had, well, was my mother there? What were you doing in Germany? How come Germany? Where did you get the strength to play? Where did you get an instrument to play? He shook his head, and it was as if the memory left him or his willingness to share it with me. That night, after I got him settled, I raced to Google. Surely there was going to be some kind of mention of this concert. And there had been a woman on the program singing, a young girl named Henia Dermashkin-Gurko. I thought, well, how many of those could there be? I probably might find her, and I did. And I discovered that a printed program existed and had been donated to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. Well, I wrote them immediately, and I got an answer saying, yes, Janet, next time you're in New York, we'd be happy to show you the program in our archives, but don't you want to see the live video testimony and the photographs? So fortunately, I was able to get to New York shortly thereafter. It was 2009. It was the last year of my father's life, although I obviously didn't know that. I get to New York with the Minnesota Orchestra on tour. I raced down to Battery Park, and the archivist donned white gloves all the way up to her elbows and reached into this tiny archival box and pulled out these teeny black and white pictures. I said, there's my father. Here is the program. At first I thought, oh, I'm going to have a translator for this. And then I realized, of course, it's in Yiddish. How else would all the DPs communicate with each other? And here is my father posing with Leonard Bernstein. I wonder if I can do this. Okay. Well, he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the left side in the second row, peering out from behind a couple people, and Bernstein is in the white shirt there on the right. And here's a close-up that I discovered of the group sitting, and my father is the one with the mustache in the last row standing with the cello. And when, I blew up pictures of the orchestra and took them to Toronto, hoping my father might identify those who might still have been unidentified at the time. And he said, oh, we played all the time, we all played all the time. And I imagined an orchestra the size of the Minnesota Orchestra, 100 musicians. It turns out that it was 17 Holocaust survivors who were themselves waiting for paperwork to leave Europe. And I said, what do you mean you play all the time? What are you talking about? And it turns out that he finally came out with the story that they were bussed twice a week by the Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, all over Bavaria in the American zone. And my father, from 1946 to 1948, didn't play 2 concerts. He played 2 with Leonard Bernstein. He played 200 concerts, bringing morale-boosting concerts to those still languishing in camps, waiting for news of loved ones, waiting for paperwork to leave Europe. And they were trying to bring the feeling that there was still beauty in the world, that maybe with the music they could, go to another plane and experience some joy. Those who were at the concert, and I know another G2 person whose father was at this concert who had survived Auschwitz, he said, if he can make such beautiful music on the piano, I can go on living. The music was transformative, penetrating through the shroud of darkness, transporting those languishing in the cabs, filling them with the belief that there might still be beauty in the world and with hope for a better life. But for my father, to make music again and to bring solace to others was a blessing, and attendees never forgot the experience. So I blew up the pictures, and I showed my father holding my breath. I wasn't sure if he would be hurt, if he would be pained, if he would be angry at me to bring this up. And he looked up and he said, Janet came, it's me. I had so much hair. And he was, I think, having a disconnect between seeing his adult daughter sitting there dying to know about these stories and him seeing himself as a younger man there. So he started scribbling late at night. His caregiver called me and said, Janet, he can hardly write. He's got Parkinson's at this point. It's a tiny scrawl. He's writing late at night. Maybe you should ask him what he's doing, So the next time I came to Toronto was later that year. And instead of waiting at the elevator for me and covering my face with noisy smooches, the door was ajar. He wasn't at the elevator. I go in the apartment, and I see him sitting very formally at the dining room table with this bunch of paper with dark scrawl. And he said, Janet came. You come here. You sit down. I read this to you. I thought, okay, what could be so urgent? Okay. I said, I thought insurance papers, tax records. I sit down, and he says in Hungarian, now I'm going to read my testimony to you. And I thought, Dad, could you just wait a second? Could I get my computer? And I thought, maybe I'll try to translate it simultaneously as he's telling me the story, which I didn't expect, obviously. So my Hungarian isn't bad. It's a 10-year-old's vocabulary. So I, of course, couldn't spell it. It's very hard to spell Hungarian. And also, I didn't have words for lynching poles, wheelbarrows, gravel pits. And what I finally started doing was, I interrupted him a couple of times and he got annoyed. So I thought, okay, I'm not doing that. And I just translated it as he told me the story and looked up words that I sounded out for later. So the story is that perhaps you don't know as well the Hungarian history, but the Budapest Jewish community, which was about 800,000 people, was the last Jewish community that was intact in 1944. It was already, seemed possible that Germany might lose the war at that point, but Hitler wanted to get this last large Jewish population. Horthy, who was the premier at the time, wanted to protect the Jews. I mean, there had been anti-Semitism for 1,000 years in Hungary, and it was just part of the life there. But he didn't imagine deporting them, or let alone murdering them. And Horthy agreed to become an ally to Germany, mainly because they had lost so much land after the First World War, and Hitler promised to restore some of this land to him if they won. So in 1944, Hitler lost his patience, and March 19th, 1944, they invaded. They kidnapped Horthy's son, they deposed Horthy, and they invaded, in fact, in the middle of a concert, my father remembers. And Adolf Eichmann went personally to Budapest to take care of this last population. So it happened very quickly in Hungary. And although they heard rumors, my mother stamped her feet and said, she was 17, I can work. I'll show those Germans, I can work. But then they thought, well, maybe they wouldn't take married women away. So many of the young teenage women hastily married, as did my parents. The night before they took my father away to slave labor in Bor, Yugoslavia, in the copper mines, they forged papers, said they were Catholic, and that's the only picture that my mother borrowed a dress, and they were able to be married. The night before, my father was deported along with thousands of other Hungarian Jewish men. They needed copper for the war effort. And so my father thought this was a death sentence, and it was for many, many people, but he was on the last train, my father, that did not go to Auschwitz. And in this letter, this testimony, my father described the brutal work as a slave laborer at the copper mines that he had to do. So between May 16th and July 6th of 1944, already 400,000 Jews were deported in less than 8 weeks to Auschwitz. And that kind of a sign that we saw all over Germany and elsewhere in Europe started appearing all over in Hungary as well. And this one, although some of you may know it, it's a very famous picture. Those are Hungarian Jews, and the officer brandishing the rifle has been identified. The child was never able to be identified. When my father was liberated by Serbian partisans, he wandered in the forest in the winter without shoes or food, covered in lice, and trudged from Yugoslavia to the border of Hungary, some 286 miles, if you could walk in a straight line. I believe him, but it's impossible to imagine. Can you imagine that your own father endured that? In rags in winter, hiding under straw at night. He carried a photo of his beautiful bride, and I believe that was something that galvanized him to try to survive. But it would be weeks before he could get to Budapest because Hitler said, hold on to Hungary, Budapest at all costs at the end of the war, and there was a brutal siege that lasted 110 days, and Budapest was leveled. So my father gave me all this testimony and the information. He refused to get up until he told me the whole story, and he passed away 6 weeks later. So I was incredibly fortunate to get his story. So I began to research at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and at the JDC offices in New York, and I discovered more Bernstein pictures, actually with them playing. My father is in the left corner there, one of two cellists. Here they are bowing, and as you can see, my father's standing to Bernstein's immediate left, very close to him. And here is a debonair shot of him at Feldafing DP camp. Doesn't he look like Bradley Cooper? Yeah. So after all the research and writing, the ending was a blessing, bringing the story full circle. So I start my book with this story of riding in the car and asking my father about whether he played with Bernstein. In 2018, I was able to go to Landsberg for a commemorative program. I got a phone call from a German lady saying, Janet, we have to teach these to the next generation, has to come from people like me. And she's a non-Jew German woman, my age. And she said, would you do us the honor to come to Landsberg next May? I said, well, yeah, I guess so. Springtime in Germany might be nice. And then she says, would you consider, it would be such an honor, would you play Kol Nidre with the German youth orchestra here in Landsberg? And that's when we were both starting to tremble, because as you know what that piece means to us, and every Jew that we know who always attends Yom Kippur. But my father played it for 30 years in our synagogue growing up in Toronto. I have played it over 30 years here in the Twin Cities, 10 years here at Mount Zion. So I didn't know what to expect, and 40 of us descended upon Landsberg, my husband and son, my brother and sister-in-law, other people whose parents were in that DP camp at that concert, and the city outdid themselves, and I whipped the orchestra in shape. They were a junior high orchestra, and they sounded like any junior high orchestra, and I helped them understand the importance of the piece, and we all ascended to a different plane, and it was such a reconciliatory evening and week, actually, that I totally felt like this story should end there and could bring people in to understand what the DPs and Holocaust survivors, how they put their lives back together again after the Holocaust. How could they? How could they go on? And with my parents, it was through music. So my intention was to lead readers through some of the difficult subject matter via an alternate route. There are many threads, traces my career. There's lots of humor throughout. Coming of age, taking care of aging parents, Hungarian food, of course, it's very prominent. And I have to tell you that most of my audiences, and I've been speaking for all last year and this year, to non-Jewish people. And the conversations have been quite heartening. People are really inspired to have courageous conversations. As a congregation, we're concerned with statelessness and displacement that continues today. And my hope was to create empathy for refugees, increase knowledge about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, racism, as a legacy for the future, for our family's legacy, beyond my music making here. But I obviously couldn't have predicted the current explosion of anti-Israel and anti-Semitism. Suddenly, the fears that I've grown up with, which were always, never tell anyone you're Jewish, my mother, and it was drilled into me. She even taught me Hungarian prayers, Christian prayers, because maybe that would protect me someday. My mama's voice echoes today. It couldn't happen here in Budapest. It just couldn't happen. And I fear the present time, like all of you, but I cannot and I must not put my head in the sand as my parents' generation did. My parents, I'll backtrack and show you that this was a poster for the Reconciliation concert. So that's then. So this was 1945, the first concert that the Jewish orchestra played, and they were still in concentration camp garb. And here I am in the present day, or 2018, playing Kol Nidre in Landsberg, Germany, the very spot that my father played to the very day 70 years later. And this is the story, my book. And here is my beautiful mother telling me that it can't happen here. My parents and millions of others had nowhere to go. No one would take them in. Today, we have Israel. We must have Israel. Being active, advocating for ourselves is our only choice, while at the same time maintaining the hope for a better world, for justice, for inspiration to keep going. And I would like to just end with a little excerpt that reflects those feelings. And I hope that I can see you in a bit if you have any questions after the service. Consider a time when hell was on earth, when hands accustomed to a musician's bow, a writer's pen, a doctor's scalpel, a painter's brush, a tailor's needle, wielded shovelfuls of rocks, limestone, or human remains. When the air smelled of smoke, ashes, and grief, when the foundations of existence and the illusions that sustain us crumbled. My father, a young man confident of his future, wrenched from society, a celebrated artist turned slave laborer. The swollen and bloody knuckles, the back-breaking effort, the swirling musical phrases stilled. Depleted by the shame of helplessness, the shock of nakedness, the dread of men in uniform stomping by, he could never again tolerate being alone. A whiff of boiling cabbage or rusted copper or dripping blood triggered distress. In our family, trust was never regained. After the years of grief and imposed silence, my father's hands to fill the stillness and the hunger to create gnawed. His playing blossomed with a vitality, profundity, and spirituality I can only marvel at now. It must have been unnerving to learn how to feel again when survival entailed learning how not to feel. At least while he was playing, music imparted peace of mind. His cello wept. His music making stirred those who were equally scarred. A strange sensation would ripple in my throat when he played. The generous vibrato warmed the sound and conveyed a deeply moving story, expressed not in words or thoughts, but in emotions, illuminating a path to rebirth. I know now that beauty and inspiration ignites the best of the human spirit. The untenable pulsating, the tactile sensation of hugging the instruments and breathing the music as one creates a current that transforms us, elevates us, unites us, and propels us in ways we cannot explain. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.